All right, diving in today, getting right into it. We're tackling something, well, pretty fundamental to philosophy. We're looking at the normative status of logic. And as a philosopher, you're no stranger to a good argument, a good logical argument.
Mhm.
But have you ever stepped back and thought about why we feel this pull, this almost obligation to follow logical rules? Is logic just describing how our minds work, or is it actually telling us how we should be thinking?
Yeah, it really is a sort of entry point to a huge, really fascinating area in philosophy. And you're right, as a philosopher, logic isn't just some tool, right? It's much deeper than that. It's kind of foundational. So, yeah, really questioning its authority, whether it has any right to tell us what to do, that's a pretty fundamental question to be asking.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, our main source is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, well, what else? The normative status of logic. It's a pretty dense read. It's super thorough, so we're here to break it down. So our mission, if you will, is to really unpack this question. Does logic have this authority over us? Does it tell us how to think? And if so, what does that even mean? How does that work? We're going to be looking at a lot of different views, a lot of different arguments, so let's get into it. First things first, I guess, when we say logic, what are we even talking about here?
At its most basic, I think, we can think of logic as the rules, the system that tells us about logical consequence, like how truth is preserved between, truth bearers, let's just call them propositions for now. And the key is these consequence relations, they guarantee truth because of, well, logic, right? Their logical structure, their form. And you'll often see this represented, with that double turnstile symbol.
Right, that symbol that shows us this guaranteed truth preservation. And I think the thing that jumps out at us as philosophers, right, is that inconsistency feels just wrong. And we're quick to call people out when their arguments don't, logically follow. It's like logic isn't just describing things, it's saying how they should be.
Exactly. And this isn't just like a modern idea. Philosophers have been wrestling with this for a long time. I mean, think about Kant, right? He saw logic as these necessary rules of thought, like how understanding has to work. Or Frege, he even went so far as to call logic like a normative science, almost like ethics, telling us how we should be thinking.
Okay, so we've got this strong sense that logic should be guiding our thinking. But as the estate entry points out, there's actually more than one way to think about, well, this whole idea of normativity.
Right. There are two main paths here. The first one, it basically takes logical consequence as given, like it's already there, it's settled. And then the question is, okay, how does that relationship between, the premises and the conclusion, how does that constrain our beliefs? Like, okay, this follows from that, so how should I be adjusting my beliefs?
That makes sense. So what's the other approach?
The second approach is, well, I think it's even more interesting, really gets to the core of things. Philosophers like Hartree Field and John McFarlane, they suggest that maybe logic's normative role actually helps us define what logic even is.
All right, now we're getting into the good stuff. So how does that actually work?
Let's start with Field. He argues that, all the standard ways of defining validity, like models, proofs, even this idea of necessarily preserving truth, they don't quite capture what we mean when we talk about validity, especially when we consider people who actually disagree about logic, different logical systems. It's like if validity just depends on which logic you're using, then, debates between logicians are just talking past each other. There's no real disagreement. It's just my logic says this, my logic says that. There's no common ground. Well, my rules say I win. Right. And to get around that, Field wants to find a notion of validity that's neutral. It doesn't depend on any particular logical system. And he thinks the key is in how valid arguments constrain our beliefs. So his idea is this. If an argument's valid, you shouldn't be able to believe all the premises and not believe the conclusion. For him, this ought, this normative aspect, is built into the very idea of validity. Now, he doesn't say this completely defines validity. He kind of sees it as a basic primitive notion. But he argues this normative part helps us understand at a deeper level what we even mean by validity.
Interesting. So what about McFarlane? What's his take on this?
Well, McFarlane, he's also on board with this idea that logic's normative role is really important for understanding it. He thinks focusing on these constraints, what we should believe given logic, can actually help us settle some of those long-standing debates about validity itself, like arguments about relevance logic or whether logic has to be formal. But McFarlane, he's maybe even more ambitious than Field. He thinks that if we can really nail down this normativity, this ought, it could actually help us decide which logical system is the right one. pinpointing the true, correct notion of logical consequence.
Okay, so both Field and McFarlane, they see this ought, this normative part, as key to understanding the is of logic, what logic actually is. But McFarlane, he sees it playing maybe an even bigger role in choosing between different logic.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. But this all brings us to a really important challenge, and it's one that Harman raised, and it's kind of a famous one. He asks, is the normative side of logic really special? Does it really set logic apart from other kinds of consequence relations?
Okay, so what's Harman worried about?
Well, he says, the ought that we associate with logic, maybe it's not so different from the ought we feel in other situations. Like, if I believe something's red, then in a way, I ought to believe it's colored, right? And that ought doesn't feel too different from I believe A and B, therefore I ought to believe A. So if logic's ought isn't, like, unique, then it's harder to say that this is what makes logic, well, logic. If every kind of implication, every kind of if-then has this normative pull, then, that pull can't be what makes logic special.
Right, that's crucial. If this ought is everywhere, it can't be what defines logic. So how could someone like Field or McFarlane respond to that, especially in a philosophical context where, distinguishing different kinds of oughts is like bread and butter?
Well, I think they'd probably say that their principles are best understood as conditionals that go one way, like if this, then that. So the fact that there is a logical entailment, that's what gives rise to the normative constraint. So if you challenge the ought, you're actually, in a way, challenging the idea of logical entailment itself. For their purposes, that connection, between consequence and this ought, that might be enough. They're not necessarily trying to say that logic has a completely unique ought, but they are highlighting the normative implications of what we already understand as logical consequence.
Right, so even if it's not like a totally unique ought, it's still a fundamental part of how we grasp these logical relationships. Now, the sub-century then goes on to talk about logical pluralism. And as a philosopher who, maybe leans towards this idea of a single unified logic, this seems like a, pretty radical shift.
It definitely adds like a whole new layer's complexity. Logical pluralism, basically. It's the idea that there might be more than one correct logic.
More than one correct logic. That seems to go against like a really basic intuition, right? That there's just one logic, this universal system of rules.
Right. That's the monist view, that there's just one fundamental logic that tells us what follows from what. But pluralists, they disagree. Now, they might say, okay, different logics are useful for different things, right? Like using classical logic for building circuits. But their real claim is stronger. They're saying that even when it comes to figuring out what logically follows from what, several logics could be equally valid. So you might have a classical logician who's perfectly happy with the law of excluded middle and an intuitionistic logician who rejects it. And neither of them is wrong. They're just like playing by different rules, but both sets of rules are legit.
So they're both playing a valid game, they just have different rule books.
Yeah, exactly. Like take Beale and Restall. They argue that the very definition of logical consequence, A follows from gamma. If and only if in every case where everything in gamma is true, A is also true. They say this definition, it depends on what you mean by case. Different interpretations of that, like models, situations, different stages of inquiry, they lead to different logics, but all equally valid.
Okay, so as a philosopher, this really complicates the normativity issue, right?
Yeah.
If there's no one right logic, then which logical norms are we supposed to follow?
Exactly. With logical pluralism, the ought of logic becomes relative. So like if I'm using intuitionistic logic, I might look at you and say, hey, you can't go from not A to A. That's not allowed in my system. But from your classical perspective, it's fine. So there's no absolute sense in which one logic is the boss dictating how we have to think. It's more like different logics, different norms, different oughts. It almost like dissolves the idea of a single universal standard of rationality, which for a lot of philosophy is a pretty big deal.
Right, that universal standard is often the bedrock for so much philosophical inquiry.
Yeah. And the SEP entry actually addresses that worry. Like, logical norms, they feel like more than just arbitrary rules, right? They seem tied to bigger goals, like finding truth, avoiding falsehood. And even pluralists might agree there. If one logic is better at leading us to true conclusions, well, then maybe that logic is like epistemically better, even if we say all these logics are correct in some sense. So even for pluralists, this pursuit of truth might be like a higher level norm that helps us choose between different logical systems.
So even if there are multiple valid logics, a philosopher's, commitment to truth might give them a reason to prefer one over another.
Right. It's like a meta-norm, helping us choose between the different sets of logical norms. Now, Field, he comes at pluralism from a different angle, more from this like non-factualist view of norms. He's skeptical about, objective normative facts, the kind of stuff that's been a headache for philosophers for ages, like how do these norms fit into a natural world? How could we even know them? Why should they motivate us? And so for Field, choosing a logic is more like this optimization problem. You're trying to balance different, often competing epistemic goals. There might not be one single right answer, but that doesn't mean we can't have like a rational debate about which set of logical norms makes the most sense for us.
So it's not that multiple logics are all equally true in describing some logical reality, but they might be equally well motivated given our goals as thinkers, as knowers.
Exactly. And both these pluralist views, they really challenge this idea that logic's norms just like impose themselves on us because the underlying logic is like objectively true. And this really contrasts with, realist monism, like what Gila Schur argues for. She sees logic as grounded in these like objective formal laws, which then give us logical norms.
Okay, so given this like monism versus pluralism debate, it seems even more important to ask, what are these norms even for? Like, what do they apply to?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the SEP entry goes next.
Yeah.
Normative for what? What activities, what practices are these logical norms supposed to be governing?
And I guess for a philosopher thinking about, like, the nature of reasoning, the most obvious answer is, well, reasoning itself.
Right. I mean, most people see logic as setting the standards for theoretical reasoning. How we form our beliefs, how we change them, how we, use inference to figure things out. It's like using disjunctive syllogism to find out where Anne is, or, realizing your beliefs are messed up if you think Anne's either at the concert or the museum, but you also don't think she's at either one. Logic is like the framework for how we should be dealing with our beliefs, not just in like fancy philosophy or science stuff, but in everyday life too.
It's the framework for making sense of the world, drawing conclusions. But the entry also brings up this idea that logic's normativity, it might go even deeper than that, like to the very act of thinking itself.
Yeah, some philosophers argue that it's not just about like conscious reasoning. Logic might be normative for all kinds of thinking, judging, believing, inferring, imagining, everything. It's like logic lays down the rules for what even counts as thinking.
Like constitutive rules. The way that, like, the rules of chess define what chess even is, not just how you're supposed to play.
Yeah, exactly. Like Searle talks about, regulative norms versus constitutive norms. Regulative norms, they govern something that already exists, like speed limits for driving. But constitutive norms, like the rules of a game, they actually create the possibility of that activity. So this view of logic says that for our thoughts to even be, thoughts, they have to like answer to logic. If someone just constantly ignores logic, you might wonder, are they even thinking at all?
Okay, but as philosophers, we know we make logical errors, right? Like all the time, everyone does. Does that mean we stop thinking every time we mess up logically?
No, not at all. The point isn't that you have to be perfectly logical, but rather that to even be a thinker, you have to acknowledge that logic like has authority over your thinking. Going back to chess, you can make an illegal move accidentally or on purpose and still be playing chess.
Right.
As long as you get the rules, you messed up, you're willing to correct it. Same with thinking. To be a thinker, you need to be sensitive to the fact that logic constrains your judgments, your beliefs, everything.
So it's more like this general disposition to be open to logic, to recognize when you've messed up, even if you don't always get it right.
Yeah, exactly. And importantly, you don't need to be consciously aware of every logical rule to be bound by them. You can use disjunctive syllogism without ever having written out that, formal logical statement of it. This view often assumes that there's this irreducibly normative level to how we describe mental life. It's not just about neurons firing or whatever. There's this ought built into it. It's a view that contrasts with purely naturalistic accounts of the mind, like what Davidson argued for, Dennett, Miller. They all said that to even have concepts to think, you need at least some basic sensitivity to logic.
Okay, so logic might be constitutive of our inner thinking lives. But the SEP entry, it also talks about logic's role in more public stuff, how we interact with others.
Right. Logic seems to set standards for things like asserting claims and having rational discussions. When you say something, you're usually trying to say something true, right? And you're committing yourself to the logical consequences of what you said. If what you're saying is inconsistent, then it can't all be true. So logic governs assertion, making sure we're being coherent, following the rules.
And how does this external role of logic, how does it relate back to our individual beliefs? Which, is kind of a central concern for philosophy of mind and epistemology.
Yeah, there are different views on that. Peter Milne, he's looked at assertion as a way to understand how logic constrains our beliefs, suggesting that it has a normative force on the set of beliefs we use as evidence. Others, like Caterina Dutil-Noves and Sinan Dogramachi, they think the social part is even more fundamental. They say logic primarily governs how we reason with each other and the normativity for our own thinking that comes from those social norms. Dogramachi even talks about this idea of epistemic communism. He says the reason we call deductive rules rational is because it helps us coordinate our thinking, make our beliefs more efficient for sharing knowledge, understanding each other.
So it's like logic's main job is to make sure we can think together effectively. But for this deep dive, we're mainly sticking to that more traditional focus, how logic norms our individual reasoning, though, of course, a lot of these points could apply to these other views as well.
Exactly. So now that we've laid the groundwork, we've got to talk about Harman's challenge, which is this really influential argument against the whole idea of logic being normative for reasoning. It's sparked a lot of debate among philosophers.
Right. Let's unpack that challenge.
So Harman's point is that we're kind of mixing things up, making a fundamental mistake. We're confusing deductive logic, which is about these static relationships between propositions, with a theory of reasoning, which is about how we actually change and update our beliefs over time. It's the difference between if this is true, then that has to be true, and given what I believe now and this new information, what should I believe next?
So logic is abstract about relationships, while reasoning is about, like, the nitty-gritty of managing your beliefs in the real world.
Exactly. And Harman says logic by itself doesn't tell us how to change our beliefs. It's not about beliefs at all, really. And once we see that, it's much harder to say how logic could directly tell us what we should believe. It's like there's this gap between the world of logic and the world of actual belief revision.
Okay, so given this gap that Harman points out, how have philosophers tried to, build a bridge between those two worlds? How have they tried to defend the normativity of logic?
Well, some have pushed back on that initial separation that Harman makes. They say he's making the divide between logic and reasoning too sharp, maybe because he's got too narrow a view of one or the other. Like folks working on logical systems for belief revision, they could say Harman's not paying enough attention to, more sophisticated tools that actually model beliefs and how reasoning works. Stuff like non-monotonic logic or dynamic epistemic logic. But even these systems, they often rely on some assumptions about logic's normative role, so we still need a good philosophical justification for that. Another approach is to kind of question the epistemological assumptions behind Harman's theory of reasoning, especially his focus on this first-person subjective approach to justification, which isn't really how a lot of contemporary epistemology works. They're more interested in finding objective conditions for knowledge and justified belief. So some argue that Harman's skepticism about logic, it's tied up with his particular views on logic and knowledge themselves. But this AP entry, it mostly focuses on a different kind of response. It's basically saying, okay, let's accept Harman's basic distinction. Logic and reasoning are different. But let's see if we can still find a meaningful connection between them, a normative connection. Just because they're distinct doesn't mean logic can't guide or constrain our reasoning in a way that matters.
Right. So even with that distinction, how can logic still have this normative influence?
Well, one way to think about it is a big goal of theoretical reasoning is to get an accurate picture of the world, right? To have true beliefs and avoid false ones. And since beliefs are about things, about propositions, and propositions have logical relationships, it seems like knowing those relationships would be helpful for that goal. If I want to have true beliefs, I should care about logic. And logical consequence and consistency, they seem especially important. If my beliefs are true, then what logically follows from them should also be true. And if my beliefs are inconsistent, then at least one of them has to be false. This connection to truth, I think, gives us at least some initial reason to think logic should matter for what we believe.
It's like a link to truth gives logic some weight, some pull over our beliefs. And that brings us back to those principles we talked about earlier, that we shouldn't be inconsistent and we should believe the logical consequences of what we already believe.
Right, exactly. And this leads to those principles like the logical implication principle, IMP. If you believe P and P implies Q, you ought to believe Q. And the logical consistency principle, INN, don't have inconsistent beliefs. They seem different, but the SP entry points out that if you make some, fairly standard assumptions, like you can't both believe and disbelieve something, and that disbelieving is the same as believing the negation, then IMP actually implies KNN if you're using classical logic.
But like we said, Harman had some pretty strong objections to these principles, right?
Oh, yeah. He showed how tricky it is to apply those abstract principles to, like, the messy reality of human reasoning. His first objection, the objection from belief revision, it basically says, just because my beliefs logically imply something doesn't mean I have to believe that thing. It might contradict a bunch of other evidence I have. And in that case, it might be more rational to change my original beliefs instead of just blindly accepting the logical consequence. Logic doesn't tell you which belief to change when things clash.
So logic alone isn't a complete guide for, navigating those belief conflicts.
Right. And then there's Broom's bootstrapping objection. Since any proposition implies itself, IMP would say, I ought to believe anything I already believe, no matter how I got that belief, even if it's totally unjustified. Just having a belief doesn't mean it's a good belief or that I should keep believing it.
That makes it even clearer.
Yeah.
IMP seems to say that even bad beliefs are okay just because they exist. What was Harmon's second objection?
That one's the objection from clutter avoidance. He says, if you apply IMP without limits, it forces us to believe a ton of, trivial consequences of our beliefs, endless, pointless stuff. Like, if I believe I'm in London, IMP says I also have to believe I'm in London, or the moon is made of cheese. I'm in London, or 2 + 2 = 4, and so on. Our minds would be flooded with useless information.
Yeah, that would get pretty overwhelming. And then there's the objection from excessive demands.
Right. Both IMP and Con, they can demand more than we can actually handle. Like if a logical consequence needs a proof that would take, longer than the universe has existed, IMP says we ought to believe it. And Con might require us to find inconsistencies in our beliefs that are way too complex for us to spot. We just can't always follow all the logical implications or find every inconsistency.
So our brains, they have limits. We can't be perfect logicians all the time.
Yeah.
And finally, there's the preface paradox. This is where being logically consistent might actually seem irrational.
Yeah, the preface paradox is a classic. It's like an author writes a book, does all this research, and they reasonably believe each individual claim in the book is true. But they also reasonably believe that, everyone makes mistakes, so probably something in the book is wrong. This creates an inconsistency. They believe each individual claim, but they also believe that not all of them can be true. It seems weird to say they should give up their well-researched beliefs just to be consistent. This seems to be a problem for both Con, because inconsistency seems fine here, and for IMP, because we seem to have good reason to not believe something that logically follows the conjunction of all the claims in the book.
So as IMP and Con, as they are, they seem to have some problems.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where bridge principles come in, right? They're trying to make a more nuanced connection between logic and our beliefs.
Exactly. McFarlane calls them bridge principles. They try to spell out the relationship between logical consequence and the rules for what we should believe. IMP and Con, those are kind of early attempts, but they're too simplistic.
And McFarlane, he gives us this framework for thinking about different kinds of bridge principles.
He does. He says these principles can vary in 3 ways. First, the kind of ought we're talking about. Is it a strong ought, like you have to do it, or is it more like you have a reason to, or even just it's okay to? Second, is it about believing something or not disbelieving it? And third, what's the scope of that ought? Does it apply to just the conclusion, or to the whole implication, or both? This gives us a lot of different options for how to capture logic's normativity.
So instead of just ought to believe, it could be reason to not disbelieve, and so on. And that scope thing, can you give an example of how that changes things?
Sure. So, Co plus O, our old friend IMP, that's narrow scope. It says if the premises imply the conclusion and you believe the premises, then you ought to believe the conclusion. A wide scope principle, like WRSA, would say. If the premises imply the conclusion, then you have a reason to, either believe all the premises and not disbelieve the conclusion, or not believe all the premises. The difference is where the ought or reason applies. The narrow scope principle, it directly tells you to believe the conclusion. The wide scope one, it's more about the combination of your beliefs. It doesn't force you to believe the conclusion.
Okay, so the wide scope principle gives you more options for how to respond to those logical implications. We also talked about the excessive demands objection, right?
Yeah.
How those simple principles might ask too much of us.
Right. A lot of these principles, especially the simple ones, they don't really deal with the fact that, our brains aren't perfect. So one way to fix that is to look at attitudinal bridge principles. In these principles, you only have to care about the logical consequences that you actually, know about. So, for example, Co plus K says, if you know that the premises imply the conclusion and you believe the premises, then you ought to believe the conclusion. This helps with the excessive demands problem because it only applies to stuff you've actually grasped. But then the question is, what kind of knowing are we talking about? Knowledge, it's true by definition, but what about when someone believes the wrong logical rules? Should they still follow what they think are the logical consequences, even if they're mistaken?
That's a really important point for philosophers. Like, we care about what we should believe, but we also know that people can be wrong about logic. So maybe we need to consider those non-factive attitudes too if we want these bridge principles to work for everyone.
Exactly. Some argue that even if your logical beliefs are wrong, you should still be consistent with them, for the sake of your own system of beliefs. So then we need principles that use things like believing that or judging that an implication holds. And remember, most people follow logic without even knowing the formal rules, right? So maybe they have this implicit ability, a disposition to see certain implications as correct. Besson's critiqued those dispositional accounts, but others, like Mercy and Steinberger, defend them as a way to ground logic's normativity in our cognitive abilities without needing that explicit knowledge of logic.
So the kind of knowing in these bridge principles, that's a big point of debate. And they also need to be careful about the difference between actively disbelieving something and just not believing it.
Right. There's a difference between you shouldn't disbelieve this and it's not the case that you should disbelieve this. And with reason, it's usually seen as a reason that can be outweighed by other reasons, unlike ought or may. And remember, we also have to consider time. Do these principles apply to our beliefs all at once? Or do they tell us how our beliefs should change over time? Wide scope principles are usually seen as applying all at once.
Okay, all these bridge principles, they give us more refined tools for thinking about logic's normativity. But what about the preface paradox? How do these principles handle that?
Yeah, that's still a problem for a lot of these principles. If we stick with those strict ought principles, the ones that say you have to believe all the logical consequences, then, like McFarlane says, we might end up with this conflict. We have this obligation to follow logic, but we also have this obligation to be, epistemically modest, to recognize that we could be wrong. And for a philosopher, that's a tough pill to swallow, this unavoidable clash in our epistemic duties.
It's not a happy ending for a philosopher who wants those duties to line up, to make sense together.
Right. So a lot of philosophers, they want to avoid that clash. One way is to use weaker principles, ones that talk about reasons instead of oughts, like WR plus B says. If the premises imply the conclusion, then you have a reason to believe the conclusion if you believe the premises. This acknowledges that logic gives you a reason, but that reason can be outweighed by other reasons, like the reason to be modest in the preface case. But then, some people argue that the preface paradox shows we don't have any logical reason to believe all those claims in the book in the first place, precisely because there's a good chance at least one of them is wrong.
So the more claims there are, the less logic compels us to believe them all together.
Yeah, some argue that. But the Satie entry then suggests what might be the best way to deal with the preface paradox, using degrees of belief, or credences, and bringing in probability. Remember, the probability of a bunch of propositions all being true together can be pretty low, even if each one individually is very probable.
Yeah, I could see that. I might be really confident in each sentence of a book, but less confident that every single one is right, just because there are so many chances for mistake. So how do we build bridge principles that use these degrees of belief, that connect logic to probabilities?
Field has this principle, DB. It says, for any set of propositions that logically entail a conclusion, the degree to which you believe the conclusion should be at least as great as the sum of the degrees you believe the premises, minus the number of premises minus one. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's a constraint on how those degrees of belief should relate. It's a wide scope principle, and you can rephrase it in terms of uncertainty. Uncertainty is just one minus your degree of belief. So DB says the uncertainty of the conclusion can't be more than the total uncertainty of the premises. This lets uncertainty build up as you add more premises, which explains how we can be pretty sure about each claim in a book, but less sure about all of them together. It's a really elegant way to bring together logic and probability and solve the preface paradox.
That is pretty elegant. All right, so the Aesop entry wraps up with some even deeper challenges to logic's normativity, starting with Kolodny's challenge.
Yeah, Kolodny takes it to a whole other level. He asks, do rational requirements, including logical norms, actually give us reasons to do things.
Yeah.
He specifically looks at like formal requirements, like being consistent, and he argues that our feeling that it's wrong to violate them, maybe that doesn't come from logic itself, but from the fact that when you're inconsistent, you're usually also breaking other rules, like rules about evidence.
So Kolodny's saying, we don't think it's bad to believe a contradiction because of logic, but because one of those beliefs is probably going against the evidence.
Right.